sciences are doing and how they are functioning and working, you could almost say on a schematic level, is they kind of rip open a space or span open a space for the emergence of a discursive field, so for the enactment of the scientific discourse as such. And the workings of this is that there's a kind of rendering discursive of certain state of affairs, objects, phenomena that become suitable objects to study. So suitable objects for science and for the scientific discourse. And basically what this makes possible and enables is that we can gain and get an access of a comprehension and an understanding of basically what makes up, in quotation mark, actual reality. So in German we have this term Wirklichkeit. There's this aspect of wirken to it. So this means effectuating, resulting in, having an influence in the sense of an actualization, and being the cause and reason for this precise actualization somewhere else. So basically, if we take physics, right? Physics tries to explicate and explain us what things surrounding us are made of, how they are relating to each other, why they are relating to each other as such, so how they affect each other, and how this effectuating comes about. So what, for example, movement is, and kind of what energy has to do with it. So there's a concept of energy, and how energy is transitioned from one form into another, and so on. And there's laws of thermodynamic and so on that give us kind of a grasp and a comprehension of the understanding of the things surrounding us. But not only this, we ourselves, the human being, is also to some extent an object to study, or an object of study for the sciences. We are subject of science in that sense, to some extent. And psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory will insist that it's impossible to render discursive like all aspects of being human, of being in the world. And precisely this attempt of rendering discursive all aspects of the human being, you could say, and all aspects of being in the world, this is precisely where psychoanalysis then will show up, and kind of something is expressing itself due to a form of what is being repressed, what is not showing up in the image, but nevertheless is there, right? And this sounds really whittled, but this is what psychoanalysis is about, as we will see. And okay, so we are ourselves to some extent made objects of study, or are objects of science. And that, for example, biology is studying the living organism, the human being as a living organism. And but there is kind of a gatekeeping of what can be suitable objects to study for science. If you take, for example, the natural sciences, then biology will study the human being as exactly this, and living organisms. So there are certain fundamental concepts and notions of biology. What is life? What life is? There's a definition of what life is. For example, a virus is at the liminal border between life and death, so it's not clear cut. And this already shows that there is a certain gatekeeping and narrowing down of what can be possible state of affairs, phenomena, and things that become objects to study, objects of the scientific discourse as such. So the discursive power of the sciences is precisely also made up by this kind of specifying and also by deciding already what is crucial in terms of recognition, of object recognition, and of kind of sorting out what possible objects of scientific discourse are. So not every state of affair can be an object of scientific discourse. And kind of by this sorting out and this decision of what is crucial for, or in terms of scientific recognition, there's also a formal and semantically reflection. So there's a kind of formally there's kind of an abstract ordering aspect to it, and a structuring and furthering of systematicity, and also like a detachment of meaning. So everything in this discursive field of the sciences has to be also rendered meaningful in a specific and unambiguous way in the best case, right? And this is kind of where sciences or the scientific discourse tries to asymptotically to aim it. So we are ourselves, to a certain extent, object of study. This is the point. And also the structure of actual reality itself is an object to study to a certain degree, right? In modern physics, which is kind of also concerned with, to some extent, at least some researchers with, and some research institutions, for example, with question with cosmological question that concern the universe, its beginning, and kind of the structure or the fabric of the universe. And then again with quantum physics, right, we have this kind of weird and kind of really mind-boggling situation where we as observers are in the equation itself, like we are affecting as observers the experimental setup, the experiment itself. And this is, of course, then really interesting also in terms of psychoanalysis. And now there's a certain precondition or a, let's say, requirement for there to be this ripping open or spanning open of the discursive field by the sciences, namely that there is a world of things, and that we have access to this world of things, and that we encounter things and then also objects in this world that can be then suitable objects to study. For example, they can be suitable objects to study, but maybe they are also not suitable objects. They are not qualified as being able to enter the scientific discourse, or not being qualified as rendered discursive, as being capable of being rendered discursive. Okay, so now in this, it's not only that there's a world of things, but in this world and in this surrounding, in this surroundment, that there are things that are put on the spot for us. They are put inside for us. They're kind of being possible of being isolated. And there's the possibility of isolating these things so that they become objects of recognition, and that we can say, okay, we isolate these objects or this state of affair. We try to kind of simulate or kind of reenact a certain state of affair that we find in our surrounding world, and kind of bring it to the laboratory and kind of care for all kind of circumstances and conditions that we can study a certain trait, a certain matter of fact, a certain state of affair under laboratory conditions, for example, so that we can really study with all what is needed, and with all kind of technical setups and kind of methodological considerations, and all methodological considerations, this particular state of affair. Now, in this precondition or requirement, there's a certain ambivalence or a certain twofoldedness, namely in the term phenomena itself, the term phenomena itself is ambiguous, is twofolded, namely that there is something appearing. We have an appearance, but something is appearing in that appearance, to say it a bit in a strange way, but to make this more tenable. For example, if you have a disease, right, the disease is causing certain symptoms. So what is showing, what is appearing, are certain symptoms in terms of the patient, and qua these symptoms, the medical clinical researchers can kind of deductively and kind of indirectly conclude what the disease is, or what the disease could be, so what the cause and the root of the symptoms is. Nevertheless, the symptoms are what is appearing, and in the symptoms there is something appearing, namely the disease, or the kind of the complex that is then called disease or illness. And so in the scientific draft or sketch up, in German we can call this Aufriss of sciences, these things that are then already rendered intelligible or are kind of gone their way through this gatekeeping so that they are qualified as suitable objects to study, that they are objects of recognition, they are put on the spot and they pop up, so to say. There's a certain kind perhaps also of affordance, right? It's not that we can avoid that objects are appearing for us. For example, if we go out for a walk, right, we see I don't know, we see trees, we see houses, streets, people walking, and perhaps a car. And the car, we see the car, or we see the alley of trees. We see not only, right, we see not only singular trees, but then we see the whole alley or the whole car as like a coherent object, that is in a sense also isolated, that consists of different parts. Of course, there's now a difference between to be made between a tree and a car, in that the car is artifactual, right? It's made up of, it's produced. We will come to that later. But nevertheless, we kind of, the car pops up, is put on the spot, and we can kind of we can name certain attributes of the car, right? So we can perhaps recognize that its color is blue, that its wheel size is such and such, and so this object is getting attributes are getting attached to these objects. They are part of this object. Also, we can make up categories, right? It's perhaps a SUV, or it's a limousine, or some other kind of car category, right? So, but it's not that we can avoid this in a sense. We are already kind of in this mode of recognizing objects. Nevertheless, this is not the only mode, one could at least argue, in which kind of we can encounter and kind of come into a relation to our surrounding. And but nevertheless, to keep one moment on this part, right? So science and the scientific draft, the scientific Aufriss, is rendering discursive these things and that are popping up as objects, and their order is also what gets discursed, and there's a meaning attached not only to the objects, but also in terms of their order, in terms of their structure, how they relate to each other, and to a certain extent this is also joined together, right? So not into a full-blown totality or into an absolute unity, right? So no, we know there were crises in the sciences with for example, in mathematics, we have the incompleteness theorem of Gödel, which basically say you cannot have a complete arithmetical system, but in every arithmetical system, you have to kind of suppose axioms from which you can then kind of evoke certain proposition. And there can be both can be shown that they are true suppositions and they are false suppositions. So there is a certain lack on an impossibility, as the theorem says, to close an arithmetical system. And either way, so the things surrounding us, we ourselves to a certain degree, and the structure of actual reality itself, so the order, or is brought, this is all brought into an order and also joined together to some extent. In that, science furthers systematicity. It furthers the systematic explication and bringing into more and more coherence what or how this order is going together. And of course, we have with someone like Popper, we had like a radical kind of turn in the scientific discourse, in that he showed that it's not that we have kind of we kind of verify our kinds of theories and models and assumptions, and then build a kind of that science built kind of a fundament of like absolute truths or universal laws, and then kind of build up onto this fundament an ever higher growing set of true statements. But Popper has shown that science is rather working by the way of falsification. So it's rather that we bring forth, or science and its researchers, the people who conduct science, it's always also communication acts, right, that made up science, and that rather we bring forth models and theories and concepts, and then we stress test them in a sense. We put them on the test bed, and we set up experiments or experimental setups. This can be not only in the natural sciences, but also in the human sciences. And basically, we push them to their limits. And this is also what other people are doing, right? You bring forth a theory and make certain assumptions, and then someone else is saying to you, right, is making arguments against your theory, and perhaps is also like proving your theory wrong. But this is then a step in the process of falsification. But it's not the argument that are brought against it are then not at all like in the sense they have a certain and this is really hard to kind of conceptualize what is happening there, right? So they have a certain furthering of knowledge in that they show that your theory is true. Nevertheless, this doesn't mean that they are, so to say, veridical for all time, right? In the sense that they have kind of have a claim or a certain grasp of what is really going on. So, but rather, Popper shows that it's science moves by falsification, and also science is a way of conduct, a way of practice. So we kind of have this, we think of it perhaps as this kind of duality between praxis and theory, and that there are certain things that happen in praxis and certain things that are happening in theory, but they are more or less kind of on different planes, or the one is like happening in universal buildings, and the other thing is happening, you know, on in the fabric, or in like some kind of company, whatever. And this is really interesting. It's called theory, praxis, scissor also, that there is kind of a certain gap between theory and praxis. And this is also something that was already discussed by Kant. He has a little essay that is called über den Gemeinspruch, was in der Theorie richtig sein mag, aber in der Praxis nicht taugt. It's more or less that. It's a little bit different, but basically it's saying, or it's entitled about the saying what may be right in theory but doesn't apply to praxis or in practice. And now one author who is like kind of questioning after what the sciences are really doing there and how we should conceive of their kind of conduct is Martin Heidegger. And his kind of uptake is that science is a way of demeanor, a way of comportment, a way of behavior. He calls this eine Verhaltung. Die Wissenschaft ist eine Verhaltung. So it's a way of how we comport, how humans comport to the world, to their surrounding. And kind of what he is suspicious about is about the scientific claim that science and the scientific approach is kind of the primal or primate and kind of the perhaps also the only suitable and reliable access to our surroundings and our being in the world. So Heidegger goes back in this discussion to Aristotle, and what he basically finds in Aristotle and what he kind of made or makes of Aristotle, not in a bad way that he kind of imposes this on Aristotle, but he really unfolds this in Aristotle, that Aristotle gains the sense of being, so what it means to be, for something to be, for a state of affair to be, not only for things, that Aristotle develops this sense of being, or has this sense of being, like because sense of being is also the orientation in a sense so the orientation of how you make up comprehension, of how your understanding is organizing and structuring around what kind of coordinates. And basically he's saying or explicating how Aristotle is making up the sense of being from a determinate being, einem spezifischen Seinen, a specific being, and now with the small b, namely from the produced, from the made available, von dem Hergestellten, from that what is put into place, you could say. And the being of this, what is put into place, is ein Fertigsein oder Verfügbarsein, a being completed, and being a result of work, you could say, and in this being the result of a work, being ready for something else, being ready for another purpose, being available. And Heidegger is now, as he's questioning after what the science are doing there and how we can conceive of the scientific conduct and the scientific practice, is that he says rather than that it's our primary access to the world, science already kind of takes up a certain being in the world, and by this already a certain sense. And through this sense of being, which is like starting with Aristotle from determinate beings, namely produced beings, made available beings, science then proceeds and develops the scientific discursive field. So this is how the space is ripped open for the emergence of the scientific discourse. Now, what Heidegger is trying to show and argue for is that this scientific way of behaving, so this Verhaltung, diese Art der Verhaltung, this mode of behavior, of comporting towards a world of objects, is funded or is grounded in a circumstantially circumspective and highly situationally procuring and trust-holding things that are surrounding or things in our surrounding into usage and in practices. And this by means of custom and convention, for example. So his kind of where he's starting is that he has also he unfolds a certain notion of life that is, for example, different to the concept of life in biology. Namely, for him, life is an anxious procuring, taking in care that leads to action, or that kind of is enacted. And by this kind of primordial being in the world, and by this kind of enlived praxis. So of course praxis is then a Greek term, and you could, or Heidegger is translating it as to bring something into usage, into a dealing, an acquaintance, and also to, by this bringing something into usage, making it familiar, making it known to you, but not in a propositional knowledge, but in a circumspective kind of know-how, you could almost say. So you know how to deal with things. And you kind of, in German we say, wir können uns auf etwas verstehen. We can kind of comport ourselves and kind of make sense of the situation, basically. And so this is really important. And now Heidegger's claim is that this this kind of primordial being in the world, which kind of then evokes and kind of unfolds this primary sense of being, from which then the scientific conduct is kind of a derivative or a modification, perhaps it's better to say it like this, is also a way, or there are specific ways of safeguarding and upholding this know-how that is specific to praxis. And this has to do with, there's two distinctions made up by Aristotle, which is between epistemikon and logistikon. Now, this sounds rather complicated, but I try to kind of break it down and unpack it. So epistemikon is movement that kind of considers movements that states, but that do not follow the inherent movement and inherent unfolding and inherent kind of way of the living. And the logistikon, rather, is movement that considers, beholds, and esteems, and can also go with this kind of flow of life and make sense, and also kind of safeguard and uphold this know-how and this this making familiar and this being familiar of things and state of affairs. Now, there is a certain kind of Verwahrung, so safeguarding, upholding, bringing into familiarity and into kind of a respectful and trustworthy way of dealing with certain things, state of affairs, phenomena. And this is phronesis. And phronesis as the seeing of praxis. And phronesis belongs to the logistikon. So it's a way of considering and consulting, in the sense of getting close to something, like making yourself, or open up yourself for an encounter, and like letting there be space for an encounter and for a dialogue, you could almost say. So this is to be considered, phronesis, as a more seeing that is not that is not theorein. So that is not the kind of abstract pure seeing or pure observing, which is then theoria, which meant in Greek, right, the kind of the accommodation of the festival of the presencing of the god. I mean, my translation is not really good here, but so this is phronesis, and phronesis also is in relation to techne, which is the knowledge guiding the producing, the making available, the putting in place, and kind of and working, like craftsmanship knowledge. So there's also this root where techniques can be traced back to techne, and techne is this for the Greeks is also this, or is primarily at all then this craftsmanship, which is entangled, or is not isolated, not devoided or departed from an artistic handling, artistic dealing with materials, or making up an artwork. This is not something else than techne. And so techne is the knowledge of guiding the producing and guiding the handling that is necessary in order to produce something, in order to put something forth, put something into work, and make something available, in the sense that I can then use this tool when it's produced, right? Okay. And so both of them, techne and phronesis, Heidegger points out, they aim in Aristotle, or they are directed at the particular beings that are moved, that are in movement, that are changing, so that they are directed at something that could be also different, and this is different, or this is another setup with the conceptualization of Aristotle of Sophia and Theoria. So it's you could say that Sophia is kind of considering the necessity, i.e. what always and consistently has to be what stands as subject in the eternity, which is not kind of suffering changes. It's not subject to change and movement, or perhaps to movement in a specific sense, but not to change. Now, and the essential consummation of the highest cognition, of the highest form of knowledge, is theoria, the pure contemplation, you could say. For Aristotle, theoria is independent of the always continuing situation of action. And this is something where Heidegger sees the development of the scientific discursive field, the ripping open of that space where there's also this gatekeeping happening, and where pure contemplation, pure observation, and with the kind of putting aside and making invisible the subjectivity, the part where we ourselves are involved, or this extent to which we are involved, also in theoria, in Sophia. And okay, so this is kind of a sketch up, and I try to outline these different modes of preserving knowledge. So there is like the mode of preserving a knowledge or a safeguarding a knowledge in theoria is for example episteme. So it's a knowledge that can then also be safeguarded in the sense that it's always the same. So this is the condition that you can deliver it to someone else, you can transmit it even to someone else. This is also really important then when Heidegger discusses modern sciences. And for example, the way of upholding practical knowledge in terms of phronensis and the logistikon, it's rather something that you have to be situated, and you have to kind of go through this kind of familiarity, so you can certain hints and certain dialogues can help you, right, to get a knowledge of how craftsmanship is working. And it's important to have a guidance and to have certain way of someone explaining you what you should be attentive to. This is also what I'm trying to do in the series. But then again, you have to speak through it, or you have to work through it. You have to really do the groundwork and build up. It's a work also to be a human being, but also to be involved into practices. It's always, you have to be really so it's not that you as subject are capable or are how do you say that you are responsible for opening up a space, but rather I think it's more in the direction that this space is already opened up, or is already opening up in a kind of processual and verbal performative form, but it's rather that Heidegger thinks that our way of our scientific stance and our scientific way of behavior is kind of closing this off. And this is right. So if we now come back to the scientific discursive field, this is something that brought great success to the sciences, or that makes them really successful. So to shut away the forms of subjectivity and the forms in which we are involved into also the practices of doing sciences, and to kind of assume that you are this neutral researcher, and that you have to building up these setups that are completely diminished and are kind of devoid of meaning, in the sense that there's only like the meaning that is attached through the scientific discourse, so that is formally and semantically reflected about by the scientific method and approach as such, and that this is kind of what our laboratories and our experimental setups should be, and nothing besides. This is what Heidegger thinks, this nothing beside. This is interesting for him, because this is the moment where we kind of we kind of close off this dimension that is opening up, and that makes possible this phronesis trait. So this is also why there's the claim not only of Heidegger but also of other authors, like for example Pierre Bourdieu, that praxis is closing off, is disappearing. So and this is really something to dwell about, something to think about, right? So what Bourdieu said is namely that the reflection, and reflection here should always be understood in the thinking after. So it's not some kind of metacognition, but it's a thinking after. So the thinking after praxis and the speaking about praxis is already putting us apart and kind of differentiating and distinguishing us from praxis itself. This is what Bourdieu says, like to paraphrase him. And so this is basically founded in the kind of traditional, if you want, so opposition of action, Handlung in German, and structure, Struktur. So that there is kind of the structure that is kind of rigidly and sets everything in order. This is also what I try to showcase, that by this discursive field of the sciences and by their workings in terms of rendering discursive and kind of gatekeeping, that there's a certain structural order enacted, and everything is brought into that structural order, and there's a certain furthering of systematicity by this means as a goal of the sciences. And what is kind of the contingent, that which is not controllable, that which then is also really hard to grapple with for the sciences, is action, right? So that which breaks into a certain structure, which also can lead to changes, perhaps, which can lead to shifts, to revolutions. This kind of rebelling aspect of action, right? And actional behavior that kind of the sciences then also grapple with, and this kind of thought a long time for as opposition, that there is this structure and then there's this contingent aspect, that which is not controllable, that which we can only kind of observe when it's happening, right? When it's performatively breaking in, which is like action. Okay, so nevertheless, we as finite cognizers that we are probably not in the position to describe and analyze every appearing thing, and for example, not every state of affair. As David Hume says, we cannot kind of, or to paraphrase some of David Hume, it's not possible for us to be able to witness every rising up of the sun, right? So we cannot know that the sun will rise tomorrow. We can kind of predict it, and we can make this assumption, but if it's the case, we don't know. And so this is kind of his like point, neuralgic point, where he dwells on, and what he stresses in terms of that, in terms of cause and effect, which is also really important then for psychoanalysis, that cause and effect, that this is something that is enacted by, or that we come up in the conduct of science, in science as a form of behavior, as a way of comportment, a way of demeanor. And it's that cause and effect is not something that is, so to say, in reality, independent of the cognizer, the subject of knowledge, but rather that the subject of knowledge comes up with way of making this rendering causality in order to have order, in order to like kind of establish a certain way of organization and structurality, and that for the purpose of having some form of stability, something to have a grip on, right? to be not completely lost and overwhelmed, but having this kind of security and controlity, and also being able to manipulate objects, right? This is something I did not speak about yet, but this is also an aspect to it. If we kind of make predictions, we can also do manipulations, and then kind of do these manipulation in a way that we pre-thought them, right? So this is, if you remember that Prometheus means forethought, it's really interesting that we have this kind of predictive aspect inside, where we do prediction, and we do kind of, through these prediction, we do also do object manipulations, and this by means of forethought, by going, so to say, into the future and actualizing possibilities. And at least in this metaphysical language, we could say it like this. Now, as finite cognizers, in the sense that we have only a finite amount of time, we cannot witness and kind of describe and analyze every appearing thing and every state of affair. So for any closure, we are in need of conceptualization. This means that we can only close and make coherent, render fully discursive. And again, this doesn't mean like a radical totality, but it means a certain kind of systematicity that makes a coherent picture, that is the world picture that is rendered as intelligible by the discursive field of the sciences, by the discursive field that is kind of unopened and span-opened by the sciences, through which we then have access to an actual reality. And so any of this kind of making coherent and bringing forth a coherent picture and representing, now is the right word, representing the order of our, like, let's say, scientific knowledge, there we need conceptualization, due to we are finite cognizers, and due to the twofoldness of what I tried to describe in the phenomena, that the phenomena is an ambiguous term in itself. And now what does it mean when something other appears? So when something appears that is not, that cannot be captured in terms of this discursive field that is kind of conducted, and that is also cared for by the sciences, in that their researchers and a whole research communities and institutions, politics and so on, are kind of working and are kind of keeping safe that the sciences will do their job, right? It's also something that companies do, in that they do corporations, and that a whole lot of financial means are given by economy, by companies from the economy, which basically give like financial means for the purpose of certain certain projects in terms of science, which are applied scientific projects in a lot of the times, right? So for like the groundwork, die wissenschaftliche Grundlagenforschung, the fundamentals of science, it's something that is more or less not so well founded as the really applied projects, like for example robotics. Now you have it that there are all kind of companies interested in robotics and kind of the possibilities and the way of making more effective production and automatization through robotics, right? And now what happens when something other appears or crops up on this stage, which is the kind of the access, or the accessed rendered image that is the granted, by science granted world picture of having at least some approach, some methodologies, and some discursive field of getting a grasp, a comprehension, understanding, at least to some extent, of actual reality, and can so that we can have control, certain kind of stability, security, but also that we can do prediction of future scenarios, and also kind of apply some of the insights and knowledge knowledge modelings, theory designs that scientists come up with, and to kind of make sure that these application processes are working in the best way possible and are effective in this sense, having effects for furthering economy and so on. Now, because it's in terms of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory that something steps on the stage, and is not really stepping on the stage, but rather digs through and kind of creeps in this rendered coherent image, which cannot be grasped by the discursive order and the discursive field made possible through the sciences, by the order of things, Foucault would said. That is, that which crops up there is not a thing, and it's not capable of being rendered in the order of things, or it cannot be brought in the order of things. It's rather some no thing that is there as well, that wills its way. Now this sounds rather spooky, but we will see. I'll try to specify this now. So at once this nothingness, this trait of affair, which crops up in terms of what psychoanalysis discovers, what Freud discovers in his cases, and the theory coming after him, must be also furnished or textured otherly than the discourse of knowledge, right? So it cannot be. So this kind of stating what happens there and what expresses itself there cannot be safeguarded or behold in the mode of episteme. It cannot be brought into propositional knowledge, and it cannot be made readily available and get produced and kind of secured in the sphere of the subject of knowledge of science. So it is not a discourse that can show us something, or that can represent us something, or where we can find some specific object or state of affair where we can directly point to it, that has like a beginning and an end and like clear-cut contours, right? And where we can, for example, where we can attach also attributes to. It's not possible in terms of what psychoanalysis deals with. It cannot be described as I described the car beforehand. So it's a discourse about an affair with a certain blocking or stoppage that it is inherent to its way of kind of going on. And in terms of its in terms of communication, there's a certain blockage or stoppage. Nevertheless, it absolutely has something to say about that which is there, that can be indicated with logical means and that can be comprehended. So otherwise, it would be right. What we also would not be satisfied with, and what would be rather a falling back to a pre-scientific era, would be if the psychoanalytic discourse turns out to be like a magical discourse, a mystic discourse. Nevertheless, what psychoanalysis has to say and what it wants to carve out and what it expresses, this is really important, can be comprehended not at all simply functioning in the order or register of knowledge. Psychoanalysis is that which modernity suppresses, and this is also why it cannot show up in the kind of the rigid order and register of knowledge of science. PA is rather a discourse in another discourse. So it's kind of this nested figure which delineates something itself, is itself something, through which something gets expressed, find contours and a gestalt, but never a full gestalt, never a full image Rather, there's always, it's rather about that which is not in the image. So there can be no, there are affects that kind of gives some contours and some form of a fragmental, partly broken Gestalt, but as psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic discourse is a more of a frontrunner, ein Grenzgänger at the side of exception that is precisely cropping up between the natural scientific discourse and the kind of philosophical humanistic discourse. And so it's and that we will see that there is never like a clear-cut figure. So also the drive is not the drive and the drives, they do not come into a coherent image. They are not figurative in this sense, but rather they break themselves. The drive is precisely what always breaks itself, in that it aims for something, but at the same time overcomes and kind of overturns its own coming to be. And so rather than coming into a full Gestalt with clear-cut contours, it's a in itself broken figure, eine in sich selbst gebrochene Figur. And the question is, who is speaking there actually? So who is making these strange kind of assumptions and these strange indications that are more or less spooky or creepy on the first impression? Which discourse is itself articulating there? What is brought forth on the plane of reality herewith? And quoted therein, there's the question, what is driven forth there?